James Mitchell stood at his office window on the 42nd floor of the Mitchell Industries building, staring at the Manhattan skyline without really seeing it. The setting sun cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines etched by 15 years of grief. At 55, he had achieved everything society deemed important: billions in his bank account, a company that dominated Wall Street, and a mansion that appeared in architectural magazines. Yet none of it mattered anymore. He glanced at the family photo on his desk, taken just weeks before the accident. Emily's smile still had the power to break his heart all over again. The therapist had suggested removing her photos years ago, saying it would help him move on. He'd fired that therapist. "Mr. Mitchell," his assistant's voice barely registered. "The real estate agent called again about the mansion. She says the buyers are getting impatient." "Tell her I'll sign the papers next week," James replied without turning around. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his scotch. Selling his company and the mansion he'd shared with Emily wasn't just a business decision, it was surrender. After 15 years of pretending he could move on, he was finally admitting defeat. The board would be relieved. They'd been pushing him to sell for months, concerned about his increasing isolation and erratic decision-making. Just last week, he'd canceled a $100 million deal because the client wanted to meet at a different restaurant than La Maison. He couldn't break his Thursday ritual. It was all he had left. He loosened his tie and checked his Rolex. 7:30 p.m. Time for his weekly ritual at La Maison, the French restaurant where he'd first met Emily 20 years ago. These Thursday dinners were the last habit he couldn't break, the final thread connecting him to her memory. As his driver pulled up to the restaurant, memories flooded back. Emily laughing over escargot on their first date, nervously admitting she'd never tried French cuisine before. The night he proposed, champagne bubbling in crystal glasses, her tears of joy making her green eyes sparkle. Their last anniversary dinner, just 3 days before the accident, when she'd told him she had special news to share that weekend. The accident. The memory hit him like a physical blow, as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. They'd left a charity gala early because Emily wasn't feeling well. The rain had been relentless, sheets of water making visibility almost impossible. The other driver ran the red light, a teenager texting behind the wheel. James still remembered the horrifying screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, Emily's scream cut short by the impact. She'd been conscious in those final moments, trapped in the mangled car. "James," she'd whispered, her blood-stained hand reaching for his face. "I love you. Promise me you'll be happy again someday." Those were her last words, spoken as sirens wailed in the distance. She was gone before the ambulance arrived, dying in his arms while he begged her to hold on. "Your usual table, Mr. Mitchell." Maurice, the longtime maitre d', led him to the corner booth, his voice gentle with familiar concern. James nodded absently, his fingers brushing against the worn velvet seat where Emily used to sit. He'd paid the restaurant generously to never reupholster this particular booth, needing it to remain exactly as it had been. "Good evening, I'm Sarah, and I'll be your server tonight." James looked up and his world stopped spinning. The wine glass he was reaching for slipped from his fingers, crashing to the floor. Standing before him was Emily, or rather a woman who could have been her twin. The same honey-blonde hair, gentle green eyes, even the small dimple when she smiled apologetically while cleaning up the spilled wine. "I'm so sorry," James stammered, helping her gather the broken glass, his hands trembling. You remind me of someone." "No worries at all," Sarah replied, her voice warm and kind, so achingly familiar it made his chest hurt. "These things happen. Let me bring you a fresh glass." James couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked away. It wasn't just her appearance. She moved like Emily, had the same graceful way of tucking her hair behind her ear. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone and found his favorite photo of Emily, taken at this very restaurant. The resemblance was uncanny. When Sarah returned with his wine, James noticed things he'd missed in his initial shock. She was younger than Emily would be now, maybe mid-30s. Her uniform was worn but immaculately clean, and there was a tiredness in her eyes that spoke of someone who worked hard for every dollar. "Have you worked here long?" He found himself asking, desperate to hear her voice again. Just started this week, actually. Sarah smiled that familiar smile again. I'm trying to make a fresh start in the city with my daughter. It's not easy being a single mom in Manhattan, but we're making it work. Before James could respond, Maurice rushed over. Mr. Mitchell, I apologize. I didn't realize we had a new server. Jennifer usually handles your table. No, it's fine, James interrupted, surprising himself. For the first time in 15 years, sitting at this table didn't feel like drowning in memories. Sarah is doing an excellent job. That night, for the first time since Emily's death, James left La Maison without feeling the crushing weight of grief. As his driver headed toward the mansion, he found himself canceling the next day's appointment with the real estate agent. Something told him he needed to keep coming back to La Maison, if only to understand why the universe had placed someone so hauntingly familiar in his path. What he couldn't see was Sarah watching his car drive away, her kind smile replaced by a calculating look as she pulled out her phone and dialed quickly. It worked perfectly, she whispered, touching the small scar behind her ear, a remnant of the first surgery that had transformed her into Emily's double. He didn't suspect a thing. Start phase 2. She ended the call and stared at her reflection in the window, practicing Emily's smile one more time before returning to work. 1 week later, James found himself back at La Maison earlier than his usual Thursday visit. He told himself it was just dinner, but his heart raced when he saw Sarah approaching his table. Mr. Mitchell, what a nice surprise, she said, arranging his silverware exactly the way Emily used to, forks aligned perfectly with the table's edge. Would you like your usual Bordeaux? You remember my wine preference? James asked, surprised. Of course, Maurice mentioned you're one of our most valued regulars, Sarah replied smoothly. Though I'd personally recommend the 1982 Chateau Margaux tonight. It was an exceptional year. James froze. The 82 Margaux had been Emily's favorite. She'd discovered it on their honeymoon in France. Before he could ask how Sarah could possibly know this, a young girl appeared beside their table, wearing a backpack and a worried expression. Mom, I finished my homework at the bar, the girl said quietly, glancing nervously at James. Amy, honey, I'm so sorry. Sarah touched her daughter's shoulder. My babysitter canceled last minute. Mr. Mitchell, please excuse this unprofessional moment. James studied Amy. She looked about 12, with serious eyes and a worn uniform from St. Catherine's School, the same private school Emily had attended as a child. St. Catherine's is an excellent school, James commented, noticing Amy's emblem. It is, Sarah sighed. We're on a partial scholarship, but with the recent tuition increase. Well, we're figuring things out. She quickly brightened her smile. Amy, why don't you go finish your reading in Maurice's office? Actually, James found himself saying, she's welcome to join me. The booth is quite empty, and I heard they make excellent chocolate soufflés here. Amy's eyes lit up, but she looked to her mother for permission. Sarah hesitated perfectly, showing just the right amount of reluctance before agreeing. During dinner, James learned that Amy loved classical music and mathematics, just as Emily had. Sarah worked 2 jobs to keep Amy in St. Catherine's, picking up extra shifts at a coffee shop in the mornings. Mom says education is everything, Amy said, carefully eating her soufflé. She works really hard so I can stay at St. Catherine's. Your mother is very wise, James replied, watching Sarah serve other tables. There was something both haunting and comforting about her presence. When the bill came, James added a generous tip and a note. The 82 Margaux next time. You have excellent taste. As his car pulled away, his driver noticed something different. You seem lighter tonight, sir. James realized he was right. For the first time in 15 years, he'd spent an evening making new memories instead of drowning in old ones. Back in the restaurant, Sarah cleaned the booth while Amy did her reading. Maurice approached with concern. Sarah, I must warn you, Mr. Mitchell has been through a lot, his wife. I know, Sarah interrupted softly. Loss like that leaves deep wounds. Sometimes people just need a chance to heal. After their shift in a small apartment across town, Sarah helped Amy with her theater exercises. You did wonderfully tonight, sweetheart. Remember, we're giving him a gift, the family he lost. That makes everything we do okay. Amy nodded uncertainly, clutching her script. But he seems nice. The nicest ones are always the loneliest, Sarah replied, checking her phone. A text message glowed. Background story holds up. School records planted. Proceed with phase 2. Sarah deleted the message and smiled at their reflection in the window. A perfect little family in the making. Everything was going according to plan. Soon, James Mitchell would have a new family to love, and she would have everything she'd spent years preparing to take. That night, James sat in his study, holding Emily's photograph. "I felt you there tonight," he whispered, in her smile and that little girl's eyes. "Is this a sign?" The photograph, like always, held no answers. But for the first time in 15 years, the silence didn't feel quite so empty. Over the next month, James found himself dining at La Maison almost every night. Each visit revealed another coincidence that left him questioning fate. Sarah would casually mention loving old jazz standards, Emily's favorite music. She'd recommend books that had been on Emily's shelf, describe dreams of visiting places Emily had loved. Martha, his housekeeper of 20 years, noticed the change in him immediately. The liquor bottles stopped emptying so quickly. The curtains were drawn back, letting sunlight into the mansion again. But something about it all made her uneasy. "You seem different," Martha said one morning, serving his coffee. "This Sarah person, she must be quite special." "She reminds me so much of Emily," James replied, not noticing Martha's slight frown. Yesterday, she hummed Moon River while serving dessert, Emily's favorite song, and her daughter Amy, she's exactly the age our child would have been. Martha's hand trembled slightly as she poured more coffee. James had never told anyone, but Emily had been 2 months pregnant when the accident happened. One rainy evening at La Maison, Sarah was helping Amy with her math homework during her break. James watched them from his booth, remembering how Emily would help her young students when she taught at St. Catherine's. "Struggling with algebra?" he asked, approaching their table. "Trigonometry, actually," Amy sighed. "Mom's great at everything except math." "That's because numbers hate me," Sarah laughed, Emily's exact words whenever she'd faced a checkbook. "I could help," James offered. "I used to tutor mathematics in college." As he explained the concepts to Amy, Sarah watched them with perfectly timed glances of maternal pride. When Amy solved a difficult problem, she spontaneously hugged James, an action that seemed to surprise even her. "Oh, I'm sorry," she pulled back quickly. "I didn't mean." "It's okay, sweetheart," James said softly, the words slipping out naturally. Later that night, Sarah was cleaning nearby when James received a phone call. Her keen ears picked up every word. "Yes, I understand the company merger needs an answer," he said tensely. "But I'm not selling anymore. I found a reason to stay." Sarah hid her smile. Everything was working perfectly. That weekend, she orchestrated their first accidental meeting outside the restaurant. James was walking through Central Park when he spotted Amy feeding ducks by the pond, Emily's favorite Sunday activity. "Mr. Mitchell," Amy waved enthusiastically. "Mom, look who's here." Sarah appeared, wearing a sundress strikingly similar to one in an old photo of Emily that sat on James's desk. "What a lovely surprise. We come here every Sunday. Amy loves feeding the ducks." They spent the afternoon together, Amy's natural charm wearing down James's remaining defenses. When she called him Dad while thanking him for ice cream, she quickly corrected herself, looking embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," Sarah apologized later. "Her father left when she was a baby. Sometimes she gets carried away with male attention." "Please, don't apologize," James said quickly. "I'm honored she feels that comfortable with me." Back home that evening, Martha was organizing Emily's old belongings, something James had never allowed before, when she found something odd. A recent magazine clipping about James Mitchell, tucked into Sarah's employment application that had fallen from her purse during a recent visit. "Coincidences," Martha muttered, studying the clipping's date. "Too many coincidences." Meanwhile, in their small apartment, Sarah reviewed Amy's performance. "You're doing wonderfully, sweetie. The dad slip was perfect." "I don't like lying," Amy whispered. "He's so kind to us." "Remember what we discussed," Sarah's voice hardened slightly. "This is all for your future. Everything I do is for you. Now practice your lines for tomorrow. We need to nail the next phase." That night, James dreamed of Emily for the first time in years. In the dream, she was smiling, pointing toward a bright light. When he woke, he felt something he hadn't experienced since her death: hope. But in the shadowy hallway outside his room, Martha stood with the magazine clipping in her hand, her decades of protective instincts screaming that something wasn't right. The question was, would James listen if she tried to warn him? The discovery of Emily's diary happened on a stormy afternoon, exactly like the weather on the day she died. Martha was helping James clear out the mansion's attic, a task he'd avoided for 15 years, when she found a small leather-bound book tucked inside an old hat box. "James," Martha said softly, holding out the diary, "I think you should see this." His hands trembled as he took the book. Emily's elegant handwriting filled each page, her last entry dated just days before the accident. As he read, tears fell onto the aged paper. "She knew," he whispered. "Listen to this. I can't wait to tell James this weekend. A baby, our own little miracle. I had the strangest dream last night, a little girl with his smile and my eyes. I even have a name picked out, Amy." Martha's head snapped up. Amy, like Sarah's daughter. Before James could respond, Sarah appeared in the attic doorway. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said, carrying a tray of tea. "Maurice said you weren't feeling well, so I brought some chamomile, Emily's favorite." Martha watched sharply as Sarah's eyes fell on the diary. Something flickered across her face, recognition, satisfaction, before she composed herself. "Oh, I'm intruding on a private moment." Sarah stepped back. "I should go." "No, please stay," James said quickly. "I was just reading. Emily wrote about a dream she had, about having a daughter named Amy." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening perfectly. That's impossible. Last night, I had this vivid dream. A beautiful woman with blonde hair was showing me photos of this house. She kept saying, 'Take care of him for me.' I woke up thinking I was going crazy, but now..." Martha fought the urge to scoff. The timing was too perfect, too calculated, but James was leaning forward, completely entranced. "I've been having dreams too," he admitted. "Emily's been appearing, smiling, pointing towards something bright, like she's showing you a new path." Sarah's voice quivered. "I know this sounds crazy, but ever since I started working at La Maison, I've felt this connection, like someone's guiding me." Martha picked up the tea tray sharply, almost spilling it. "I'll refresh this," she said, but neither James nor Sarah seemed to hear her. Downstairs in the kitchen, Martha examined the diary more closely. The leather was aged, the ink faded, except for that last entry about Amy. The ink there seemed fresher. But who would have access to Emily's diary to make such an addition? Her thoughts were interrupted by Amy's arrival for her now regular tutoring session with James. The girl paused in the kitchen doorway, staring at Emily's portrait on the wall. "She's so pretty," Amy said softly. "Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I think I see her. She strokes my hair and says everything will be okay." Martha's suspicions crystallized. These visions were too coordinated, too convenient. But as she opened her mouth to question Amy, Sarah appeared. "Sweetie, why don't you start your homework in the study? Mr. Mitchell will be down soon." Sarah's tone was light, but her grip on Amy's shoulder was tight. After Amy left, Sarah turned to Martha with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've been here a long time, haven't you, Martha? You must care deeply for James." "Like family," Martha replied firmly. "Family is so precious," Sarah's voice softened. "Especially when you've lost someone. Sometimes the universe gives you a second chance. It would be cruel to stand in the way of that, don't you think?" The threat was subtle but clear. Martha held Sarah's gaze, years of protective instinct warring with the fear of hurting James if she was wrong. Upstairs, James was lost in Emily's diary, finding more signs with each page. A mention of a dream about meeting her soulmate at La Maison, where he'd met Sarah. A description of a perfect Sunday feeding ducks in Central Park, where he'd run into Sarah and Amy. When he finally joined them in the study, he found Amy solving equations while Sarah arranged fresh flowers, lilies, Emily's favorite. The scene was so domestic, so natural, it made his heart ache. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, adjusting the flowers. The house seemed to need some life. "No, it's perfect," James replied. "Everything is perfect." From the doorway, Martha watched James's face glow with renewed hope. She looked down at the diary in her hands, at the slightly different ink on that crucial page. She had proof something was wrong, but would exposing it hurt James more than the lie? In the study, Sarah caught her reflection in the window and allowed herself a small smile. Phase 2 was complete. The spiritual connection was established. James was seeing signs everywhere, each one carefully orchestrated to draw him closer. Even his skeptical housekeeper wouldn't risk destroying his newfound happiness. That night, after everyone had left, James sat in his study reading Emily's diary over and over. "Are you really showing me the way?" he whispered to her portrait. "Is this the happiness you wanted me to find?" In the corner, the fresh lilies cast dancing shadows on Emily's diary, their sweet scent masking the faint smell of new ink on its pages. Sarah's psychic friend arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon, exactly 2 months after Sarah had entered James's life. Grace Thompson introduced herself as a spiritual medium, her silver jewelry tinkling softly as she shook James's hand in his study. "Sarah told me about the amazing connections you've been experiencing," Grace said, her eyes moving purposefully to Emily's portrait. She gasped dramatically. "Oh, her energy, it's so strong in this room." Martha, arranging tea by the window, tried not to roll her eyes. She'd done her research on Grace Thompson. Until 6 months ago, she'd been Grace Martinez, a small-time actress with a history of insurance fraud. Can you sense her?" James asked, his voice tight with emotion. Grace closed her eyes, swaying slightly. "She's here. She's always been here, watching over you. She's so happy you're finally letting love back into your life." Grace's eyes opened, fixing on Sarah. "She led you to each other." Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I've felt her presence too, in dreams, in little signs. The signs are her way of blessing this connection," Grace continued, reaching for both James and Sarah's hands. "Oh, she's showing me something. A ring. Yes, a sapphire ring." James went pale. "Emily's engagement ring. I still have it in the safe." Martha's head snapped up. She'd helped James store that ring away years ago, and she'd seen Sarah studying the safe in his study last week when she thought no one was watching. "She wants you to use it again," Grace whispered. "When the time is right, she wants you both to be happy." Sarah pulled her hands away, appearing overwhelmed. "I need a moment," she whispered, hurrying from the room. James moved to follow her, but Grace held him back. "Give her time to process. This is overwhelming for her too. Such a pure soul, taking on this spiritual responsibility." In the hallway, Martha found Sarah pressing her phone to her ear. "Everything's set. Yes, the ring is in the safe. No, the housekeeper won't be a problem." She spotted Martha and smoothly switched her tone. "Yes, Amy, sweetie, I'll pick up your prescription after work. Love you." That evening, after Grace had left and Sarah had returned to comfort James, Martha made a crucial discovery. Hidden in the study's trash can was a crumpled receipt. Grace Thompson had purchased her spiritual jewelry just days ago at a costume shop. But when Martha tried to show James, she found him in the garden with Sarah and Amy, looking happier than he had in 15 years. They were planting Emily's favorite roses, Amy calling him Dad without correcting herself now, Sarah's hand resting comfortably on his arm. "I can't remember the last time I felt this peaceful," James told Sarah later as they walked through the garden. "It's like Emily's been guiding us to this moment." "I feel it too," Sarah said softly, "like this was meant to be. Amy adores you, and I." She let her voice trail off perfectly, looking away with calculated shyness. Later that night, in their apartment, Sarah reviewed security camera footage of James's study on her laptop, paying special attention to the safe's combination as he opened it. Amy sat doing homework, growing increasingly uneasy. "Mom, Martha knows something's wrong," she whispered. "I saw her watching us today." "Martha is a loyal employee who knows her place," Sarah replied coldly. "And if she doesn't, well, loyal employees can be replaced. Now practice your lines for tomorrow. The engagement has to seem spontaneous, natural." "But he's so kind to us," Amy protested weakly. "Maybe we could just what?" Sarah's voice sharpened. "Go back to nothing, to struggling. Everything I do is for your future. Remember that." In the mansion, Martha sat in her small room, surrounded by evidence, the receipt from the costume shop, photos of Sarah studying the safe, the magazine clippings found in her purse. But her hand trembled as she reached for the phone to call the police. On her desk sat a photo taken that afternoon, James laughing with Amy, his eyes bright with joy for the first time since Emily's death. How could she take that away from him? And if she was wrong? if this really was Emily's way of giving him a second chance. Martha put the phone down, her heart heavy with indecision. In the garden below, the roses Sarah and James had planted swayed in the evening breeze, their thorns hidden beneath beautiful blooms, much like the woman who had orchestrated this entire performance. The evening of James's proposal began like a perfectly choreographed dance. La Maison was decorated with Emily's favorite flowers, white lilies and pink roses. The 82 Margot was breathing in crystal decanters. Even the weather cooperated, with a soft summer rain that reminded James of his first date with Emily. Sarah had no idea what was coming, or at least that's what everyone was supposed to believe. She moved through the restaurant with practiced grace, her new silk dress, a gift from James, catching the candlelight. "Everything's perfect," Maurice assured James, who was fidgeting with Emily's sapphire ring in his pocket. "Just like you planned." Martha stood in the corner, watching Sarah's performance with growing unease. The way Sarah's eyes darted to James's pocket, the calculated way she'd positioned Amy at the perfect table to witness everything. It was all too perfect. "Dad," Amy called out as James walked past her table. The word no longer carried any hesitation. "Is tonight the special night?" James smiled, touching the ring box nervously. "How did you know?" "Just a feeling," Amy replied. But her eyes flickered to her mother with something that looked almost like guilt. The proposal itself was a masterpiece of timing. James waited until Sarah served his table, then took her hand before she could step away. The restaurant fell quiet, as if on cue. "Sarah," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "These past 3 months have been a miracle. You and Amy have brought light back into my life in ways I never thought possible." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth in perfectly practiced surprise as James knelt. Behind them, Amy started recording with her phone, just as she'd been instructed. "I believe Emily sent you to me," James continued, tears in his eyes. "Every sign, every moment has led to this. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The sapphire ring caught the light exactly as Sarah gasped. For a split second, Martha saw something flash in her eyes, triumph, before it was replaced by tears of joy. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "Oh, James, yes." The restaurant erupted in applause. Amy rushed forward to hug them both, creating the perfect family picture. Only Martha noticed how Sarah's first movement had been to slip the ring on her finger rather than embrace James. Later that evening, in James's study, his lawyer presented the prenuptial agreement. Sarah played her part beautifully. "I don't want anything," she insisted, pushing the papers away. "Your love, our family, that's all Amy and I need." James, moved by her apparent selflessness, shook his head. "I want to take care of you both. You've given me back my life." Sarah protested just enough before signing, her eyes scanning the document with more understanding than a waitress should have. Martha, serving coffee, noticed how Sarah's finger lingered on the clause about joint access to accounts after 6 months of marriage. "To our future," Sarah raised her coffee cup, her other hand reaching for Amy. But Amy was staring at the prenuptial agreement with troubled eyes. After everyone left, Amy confronted her mother in their apartment. "Mom, this doesn't feel right anymore. He really loves us. Maybe we could just what?" Sarah's gentle mask slipped for a moment. "Go back to nothing. Everything I've worked for, all the planning, the surgeries, the research, it's all for you, Amy, for our future." "But he'd help us anyway," Amy insisted. "He's kind. Kind men are kind until they're not," Sarah snapped. "Trust me, this is the only way to guarantee our security. Now, go practice your speech for the engagement party. It needs to be perfect." Back at the mansion, James sat in his study, holding Emily's photo next to his new fiancée's. The resemblance was still startling. "I feel you in every moment with her," he whispered to Emily's image. "This is what you wanted for me, isn't it?" Martha entered quietly, holding a file. "Mr. Mitchell, there's something you should see about Sarah's background." "Not tonight, Martha," James interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Nothing can spoil this moment. For the first time in 15 years, I'm truly happy." Martha looked at his glowing face, then at the file in her hands. It contained proof of Sarah's previous identity, her connections to Grace, the planned timing of everything. But could she bring herself to destroy his happiness, even if it was built on lies? In the garden, Sarah stood alone, practicing her loving smile in a window's reflection. The sapphire ring glinted as she reached up to touch the surgical scar behind her ear, the physical price of becoming Emily's double. 6 months, she reminded herself. 6 months until she had access to everything. She pulled out her phone and dialed. "Phase 3 complete," she whispered. "Start transferring the offshore accounts, and find me a buyer for that sapphire ring, after the honeymoon, of course." Upstairs, Amy lay awake, torn between her growing love for James and her loyalty to her mother. On her phone, she played back the proposal video, watching James's sincere face, her mother's calculated performance. Her finger hovered over the delete button, but she couldn't press it. Some truths needed to be preserved, even if she wasn't sure why yet. Martha had finally gathered enough evidence. Bank records showing Sarah's previous identities, photos of her meetings with known con artists, documentation of her plastic surgeries by a disgraced doctor. Most damning of all, a pattern of similar cons across 3 states. She waited until James left for a business meeting before confronting Sarah in the mansion's kitchen. "I know everything," Martha said, spreading the documents across the counter. "Sarah Phillips isn't even your real name." Sarah's loving mask dissolved instantly, replaced by cold calculation. "How long have you been digging into my past?" She picked up a photo of herself before the surgeries. Impressive detective work for a housekeeper. 5 similar cons in 3 years, Martha continued. Grieving wealthy men, mysterious spiritual connections, quick marriages. She held up another document. "But you've never aimed this high before. James Mitchell is worth billions. And he's so desperate to believe Emily sent me that he's making it almost too easy." Sarah's smile turned cruel. "Do you know what it's like watching someone for months, learning their habits, their weaknesses? I know exactly how Emily moved, talked, even held her wine glass. I'm going to tell him everything." Sarah laughed softly. "No, you won't, because you've seen how happy he is. Are you really willing to destroy that? He deserves the truth." "The truth." Sarah stepped closer. "The truth is, I'm giving him exactly what he needs, a beautiful lie. He gets his Emily back, Amy gets a father who adores her, and I get, well, everything else. Amy's not even your real daughter, is she?" Something dangerous flashed in Sarah's eyes. "Amy is whatever I need her to be. Right now, she's James's perfect stepdaughter-to-be, and she knows what happens if she forgets her role." Martha reached for her phone. "I'm calling the police." "With what evidence?" Sarah swept the documents into the sink, flicking on the garbage disposal. "Oops. And before you mention copies." She pulled out her own phone, showing a text message. "My associates are at your sister's nursing home in Buffalo right now. Margaret, isn't it? Room 304. Would be tragic if her medication got mixed up." Martha froze. "You wouldn't. Try me. One call from you to James or the police. One hint that something's wrong." Sarah let the threat hang. "Now I suggest you take a little vacation. Visit Margaret. Make sure she's, well, cared for. He'll figure it out eventually. By then it'll be too late. 6 months of marriage, joint access to all accounts, and then..." Sarah gestured to the destroyed documents. "Sarah Phillips disappears forever. James gets his heart broken one more time, but he'll survive. He did before." Martha felt tears of frustration burning her eyes. "I've watched him for 15 years, helped him survive losing Emily. I can't watch him go through that again." "Then don't watch. Leave. Now." Sarah's voice hardened. "Or Margaret pays the price for your loyalty." Heavy footsteps in the hallway made them both turn. Amy stood in the doorway, her face pale. She'd heard everything. "Mom." Her voice trembled. "What are you doing?" Sarah's mask slipped back on instantly. "Amy, sweetheart, Martha and I were just discussing her upcoming vacation, weren't we?" Martha looked at Amy, seeing the girl's inner struggle. "Amy, you know this is wrong." "Amy knows what's best for her future," Sarah cut in smoothly. "Don't you, sweetheart?" Amy's eyes filled with tears as she looked between them. The weight of the truth pressed against her chest, but her mother's subtle threat hung in the air. I should go do my homework," she whispered, fleeing upstairs. Sarah turned back to Martha. "You have 1 hour to pack and leave. I'd better get confirmation you've arrived in Buffalo by tonight." "He trusts you completely," Martha said quietly. "That's what makes it perfect." Sarah tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, exactly like Emily used to. Love blinds people to the most obvious truths. In her room, Martha packed quickly, her hands shaking. The evidence she'd gathered was useless now. Sarah's network was clearly larger and more dangerous than she'd imagined. As she carried her suitcase downstairs, she heard James's car pulling up. Sarah was already at the door to greet him, perfectly poised, Emily's sapphire ring catching the light. "Martha," James called out, seeing her suitcase. "Are you going somewhere?" "My sister's ill," Martha managed. "I need to. I have to." "Of course, take all the time you need," James said kindly. "Sarah and Amy will take good care of everything here." Sarah smiled triumphantly over his shoulder as she embraced him. "We'll miss you, Martha. Give Margaret our best." Martha took one last look at James's happy face before walking out. In the upstairs window, she saw Amy watching, tears streaming down her cheeks. The truth would have to wait. For now, Martha could only pray that someone else would see through Sarah's perfect performance before it was too late. The weeks before the wedding transformed the Mitchell mansion into a fortress of deception. Sarah had skillfully isolated James from anyone who might question their whirlwind romance. Old friends' calls went unreturned. Business associates were politely uninvited from the ceremony. Even his sister's concerns about the rushed timeline were dismissed as jealousy. "It's just nerves," Sarah soothed one evening, as James questioned whether they should postpone. "Cold feet are normal." She positioned herself by the window, letting the sunset cast the same golden light that filled their favorite photo of Emily. "Besides, Emily's been sending us so many signs. The other night, I dreamed she was helping me choose my wedding dress." But alone in her room, Amy struggled with mounting guilt. She watched James showing her mother the family vault, explaining which jewels had belonged to Emily, trusting her completely. The sight of her mother's calculating smile made her stomach turn. That morning, Amy had discovered something that changed everything. While searching for her mother's phone charger, she'd found a notebook detailing their con, including a list of potential buyers for the Mitchell family jewels. Next to Emily's sapphire ring was a price, $2 million. The sound of James's laughter drifted up from the garden, where he was showing Sarah his restored classic car collection. "Emily loved this one best," he was saying. "We drove it on our honeymoon through France." "Let me guess, she insisted on taking the coastal route to Marseille." Sarah's voice carried the perfect mix of intuition and innocence. James's delighted gasp confirmed another successfully researched detail. "How did you know?" Amy felt sick. Every magical connection was meticulously planned. Every coincidence orchestrated. Every sign from Emily manufactured. She picked up her phone, looking at Martha's number. 2 weeks had passed since the housekeeper's abrupt departure, but her mother's threat about Margaret hung heavy in the air. One call could ruin everything, or save James from heartbreak. Downstairs, the wedding planner reviewed final details. Sarah had chosen Emily's favorite flowers, requested the same wedding march, even selected a similar dress style. Each choice made James more certain that Emily was blessing their union. "Look what I found," James said that evening, bringing out a dusty photo album. "Emily and I at La Maison, the night we met." Sarah studied the photo intently, memorizing every detail of Emily's posture and expression. Later, Amy would catch her practicing the exact same laugh in her mirror. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. Sarah tensed, but it was only Grace, their spiritual advisor, arriving for another staged session. "The veil between worlds is thinning," Grace announced dramatically. "Emily's presence grows stronger as we approach your union." But halfway through the session, Grace went off script. "I'm sensing something else, a warning about." Her eyes met Sarah's briefly, and cold fear flashed between them. "Never mind," the energy shifted. Later, Sarah cornered Grace in the kitchen. "What was that about?" "Martha's been asking questions in Buffalo," Grace whispered. "She's not staying away like she promised." Sarah's face hardened. "Handle it. Up Margaret's dosage if you have to." "Sarah, maybe we should cut our losses. Mitchell's wealth isn't worth." "We're too close," Sarah hissed. 3 more days until the wedding, then 6 months of marriage, and we're set for life." Neither noticed Amy in the doorway, recording everything on her phone. Her hands shook as she saved the video, buried deep in a folder labeled Math Notes. That night, Amy lay awake, listening to her mother's phone calls. Words like, offshore accounts, and untraceable transfers drifted through the walls. In 3 days, James would marry a woman who'd spent months becoming the perfect copy of his dead wife. Every smile, every gesture, every spiritual connection was part of an elaborate performance. The engagement ring on her mother's finger, Emily's ring, caught the moonlight. Soon it would disappear into the hands of some collector, along with every other precious memory James had treasured for 15 years. Amy opened her phone again, staring at Martha's number. One call could stop everything. But what would happen to her, to Margaret, to James's fragile happiness? In Buffalo, Martha was already on her way back, evidence in hand. She'd discovered Sarah's real identity, her history of cons, and most importantly, proof that Amy wasn't her daughter but a talented child actor groomed for these schemes. The question was, would she make it back in time? And would anyone believe her before Sarah completed her greatest performance? 3 days. The countdown to either a wedding or a revelation ticked steadily forward, while James slept peacefully, dreaming of his second chance at happiness. The morning of the wedding dawned with picture-perfect clarity, exactly as Sarah had planned. The Mitchell mansion's gardens were transformed into a fairy tale setting, with white lilies and roses everywhere. The same string quartet that had played at James and Emily's wedding was setting up near the altar. Sarah stood before her mirror, studying her reflection. The wedding dress was an exact replica of Emily's, down to the last pearl. She practiced Emily's smile one final time, touching the surgical scars hidden beneath her hair. 3 surgeries and countless hours of practice had led to this moment. "You look just like her," Amy whispered from the doorway. Her flower girl dress matched the one in Emily's wedding photos. "That's the point, darling." Sarah adjusted her veil. "Is everything ready?" Amy clutched her phone, where the damning video felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. "Mom, please, we can still stop this. In 12 hours, we'll be legally family. In 6 months, we'll be set for life." Sarah's voice hardened. "Don't ruin this now." Downstairs, James was showing early guests around, beaming with joy. He'd invited Emily's parents, who couldn't stop remarking on Sarah's uncanny resemblance to their daughter. "It's like Emily sent her to you," Emily's mother kept saying, exactly as Sarah had predicted she would. The ceremony was set to begin at sunset. Sarah had timed everything perfectly, knowing the golden light would create the same glow that surrounded Emily in her wedding photos. But as guests took their seats in the garden, 2 unexpected arrivals threatened to unravel everything. Martha slipped in through the kitchen entrance, clutching a file of evidence. At the same moment, a man Sarah hadn't seen in years appeared at the garden gate, Dr. Klein, the surgeon who'd transformed her face. Sarah saw them both and quickly dispatched her bridesmaids, actually members of her con artist network. Handle them, quietly, but she hadn't counted on Amy. The guilt of the past months, the weight of every lie, every manipulation, finally broke through. As the wedding march began to play, Amy made her choice. James stood at the altar, his eyes glistening as Sarah appeared in Emily's dress, moving with Emily's grace. The sunset created a halo around her, just as planned. Everything was perfect, until Amy stepped forward instead of scattering rose petals. "I can't do this anymore," she announced, her voice shaking but clear. The music screeched to a halt. "It's all fake. Everything's fake." "Amy, honey," Sarah started, but Amy pulled out her phone. "She's not my mother. I'm an actress. She hired me to play her daughter." Amy's words cut through the stunned silence. She had surgery to look like Emily. She studied her for months. Everything, every coincidence, every spiritual sign, it was all planned. Sarah lunged for the phone, but Amy had already pressed play. Sarah's own voice filled the garden. 3 more days until the wedding, then 6 months of marriage, and we're set for life. James staggered back as if physically struck. "What?" "It's not what you think," Sarah started, but Martha burst through the crowd. "It's exactly what you think." Martha held up her file. "Her real name is Victoria Reeves. She's run this exact con before. The grieving widower, the spiritual connection, the perfect second chance. It's all an act." Dr. Klein stepped forward next. "I performed the surgeries." She brought photos of Emily, demanded every detail be perfect, even had voice coaching to match her patterns of speech. The garden erupted in chaos. Sarah's bridesmaids tried to run but were caught by security. Grace, the psychic, was recognized by one guest as a former drama school classmate. The dreams about Emily, James's voice was hollow. The coincidences, Amy's visions. All researched, all planned, Amy admitted, tears streaming. She studied Emily's diaries, photos, everything. She even added that fake entry about dreaming of a daughter named Amy. Sarah's Emily-like demeanor cracked completely. She lunged for Emily's sapphire ring, but James caught her wrist. "You're hurting me," she gasped in Emily's perfect voice. "One last performance. Stop." James's word cut like ice. No more acting. Sarah's face transformed. Emily's gentle expressions replaced by cold fury. "You made it so easy," her natural voice emerged, harsher and lower. "So desperate to believe Emily was sending you signs. Every time I imitated her laugh, her walk, her little habits, you fell deeper under the spell." "The other families," Martha added. "Show him." Photos appeared on Amy's phone. Sarah with different faces, different men, different stolen lives, each time targeting wealthy widowers, each time disappearing with their money. "I gave you everything," James whispered. "My trust, my love, my home. You gave it to a ghost," Sarah spat. "I just wore her face." The police arrived, called by Martha. As they led Sarah away, she called out to Amy, "You could have had everything. A real father, a real life." But Amy was clinging to James, sobbing real tears now. "I'm so sorry. She promised me a family, but what we had these past months with you, that felt real." James looked at the sobbing child actor who'd played her part too well. In her tears, he saw the same longing for family that had blinded him to the truth. The garden slowly emptied of shocked guests. The string quartet packed away Emily's wedding march. The perfect sunset faded to darkness. Later, in his study, James held Emily's real diary, finding the forged entry about Amy. Every page of their real love story had been twisted into a script for Sarah's performance. "What do we do now?" Amy asked quietly from the doorway. She was supposed to be with child services, but no one had the heart to take her away yet. James looked at the girl who'd chosen truth over deception, who'd broken free from Sarah's manipulations to save him. Then he looked at Martha, who'd risked everything to protect him. "We heal," he said finally, "together." In her cell, Sarah stared at her reflection. Emily's face still perfect, but now a prison instead of a tool. She'd played the role of a lifetime, but in the end, real love had proved stronger than her perfect performance. The morning after the failed wedding, reporters swarmed the Mitchell mansion. The story was too sensational to ignore. A con artist surgically transforming herself to impersonate a dead wife, a child actor hired to complete the illusion, a spiritual medium running interference. It read like a Hollywood script. Inside his study, James sat surrounded by the evidence of Sarah's deception. Photographs of her previous cons lay scattered across his desk, each showing a different face but the same calculating eyes. Martha had compiled everything: bank records, surgeon's notes, even recordings of Sarah practicing Emily's mannerisms. "Mr. Mitchell," Detective Rogers said gently, "we need your statement about when the deception began." But James could barely speak. Every memory of the past months had been poisoned. Every moment he'd thought Emily was sending him signs had been carefully orchestrated. Even the way Sarah had bumped into his table that first night at La Maison had been rehearsed. "She studied me for months before making contact," he finally managed. "Learned everything about Emily, about our life together." In the next room, Amy sat with a social worker, her small shoulders bearing the weight of her confession. "She found me at a children's theater in Chicago," she explained. "Said I looked perfect for the part. She promised me a real family." The social worker glanced through Sarah's phone records. "Did you know about her previous cons?" "Not at first," Amy wiped her eyes. "But then I heard her talking about selling Emily's jewelry, about offshore accounts. She said it was too late to back out, that no one would want me after what I'd done." A commotion outside drew everyone to the windows. Sarah was being escorted from the police station to a waiting car, still wearing Emily's wedding dress. She'd refused to change, playing the role until the bitter end. "James," she called out, seeing him at the window. Her voice was pure Emily, making his heart clench despite everything. "Please let me explain. Our love is real." James watched as she fought against the officers, her performance finally cracking when they seized Emily's sapphire ring from her finger. "That's mine." Her natural voice emerged, harsh and angry. "I earned it. Do you know how hard it was becoming her? Learning every detail, every habit, every stupid little gesture." The mask had completely shattered. In its place was a fury that looked alien on Emily's features. It was like watching a beloved photograph distort into something nightmarish. "The other families want to press charges," Detective Rogers informed James. "We're looking at multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, conspiracy." "She wasn't working alone," Martha added. "Grace, the bridesmaids, even Amy's acting coach. They were all part of her network." James barely heard them. He was staring at Emily's ring, now sealed in an evidence bag. The symbol of their love had become proof of an elaborate con. Amy appeared in the doorway, looking lost. "I have to go with child services now, don't I?" Everyone waited for James's response. This girl had lied to him for months, played on his deepest emotions, but she'd also been the one to stop the wedding, to choose truth over Sarah's promises. "Actually," he said slowly, "I've been talking to my lawyers, if you need a home." Amy's eyes filled with tears. "But after everything, how can you even look at me?" "Because you told the truth, because you risked everything to stop her." James knelt before her. "And because these past months, not everything was a lie, was it?" Amy shook her head, crying openly now. "I really did start thinking of you as my dad. That's why I couldn't let her hurt you anymore." Outside, Sarah was still ranting as they put her in the car. He wanted to believe. They all want to believe. I just gave them what they needed. But her words were drowned out by the closing car door. Her final performance had ended, leaving behind a tangle of truth and lies that would take time to unravel. In the study, James held Emily's real diary, untainted by Sarah's forged entries. "I promised you I'd find happiness again," he whispered to Emily's memory. "I just never expected the path to it would be like this." Amy touched his arm tentatively. In her free hand, she held her phone with the incriminating videos, now evidence of both deception and redemption. The sun was setting over the garden where, just yesterday, an elaborate lie had finally unraveled. But in its place, something real had emerged from the wreckage. A different kind of family, bound together not by blood or deception, but by the choice to embrace truth, no matter the cost. 3 months after the wedding that never was, the Mitchell mansion began to feel like home again. The garden's wedding decorations had long been cleared away, replaced by Amy's art projects and science fair posters. Where Sarah had tried to recreate Emily's life, Amy was creating something new, something real. The adoption papers came through this morning. James announced over breakfast. Martha beamed as she served their usual Saturday pancakes, a new tradition they'd started together. "Really?" Amy looked up from her homework, hardly daring to believe it. "Really?" James slid the official documents across the table. "If you still want to, you can legally be Amy Mitchell now." Martha watched as Amy traced her fingers over the name. After Sarah's arrest, they'd discovered Amy's real story. Abandoned at 6, bouncing between foster homes until Sarah found her at a children's theater. The perfect actress for her perfect con. "But what about?" Amy hesitated. "What about when people talk? Everyone knows what happened." "Let them talk," James said firmly. "You chose truth over lies. That's the kind of daughter I'm proud to have." The doorbell interrupted their moment. Detective Rogers had arrived for their weekly update. The case against Sarah and her network was growing stronger every day. "We've located most of Emily's jewelry," the detective reported. "Sarah had buyers lined up all over Europe. The sapphire ring was meant for a collector in Geneva." James nodded, no longer flinching at these revelations. "And Grace, the fake medium, singing like a bird. Turns out Sarah's network has pulled this con 6 times before. Never this elaborate, though. The surgical transformation, the spiritual connection angle, that was new." Amy listened from the stairs, remembering how convincing Sarah had been, how she'd made everyone, even Amy herself, almost believe in the fairy tale she'd created. "We found this in her cell," Detective Rogers added, placing a notebook on the table. "It's her research on Emily. Every detail, every mannerism, every story, all cataloged and practiced." James didn't touch the notebook. "Destroy it. Sir, it's evidence." "We have enough evidence. That's not Emily. That's someone trying to wear her life like a costume." After the detective left, Amy found James in his study. The photo of Emily still held its place of honor, but now it shared the wall with new pictures, Amy's school photos, candid shots of their growing family, moments that were genuine instead of staged. "Dad," the word came naturally now. "Can we visit Mom's grave today?" James looked up, surprised. They'd never been to Emily's grave together. "Are you sure?" "I never met her," Amy said softly, "but Sarah used her memory to hurt you. Maybe we can make some real memories instead." Martha appeared with their coats, her eyes glistening. This was healing, messy and real, and nothing like Sarah's perfectly scripted performance. At the cemetery, Amy placed fresh lilies on Emily's grave, not because they were Emily's favorite flowers, but because Amy had chosen them herself from the local market. "I wish I'd known you," Amy whispered to the headstone, "but I promised to take care of him, for real this time." James wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and Martha stood close by. They made an odd family, the grieving widower, the former child actor, and the housekeeper who'd risked everything to protect them. But they were real. Back home, Amy hung her first report card as Amy Mitchell on the fridge. All A's, earned through her own hard work rather than Sarah's scripted perfection. "Emily would have loved you," James said quietly, "not because you remind me of her, but because of who you are." That night, Martha found them both asleep in the study, surrounded by Amy's college brochures, real dreams replacing Sarah's calculated schemes. On the desk, Emily's diary lay open to its last true entry. Love makes the most beautiful things grow. And finally, genuinely, it had. 1 year after Sarah's deception unraveled, the Mitchell mansion hosted another gathering. This time, there were no elaborate decorations or staged moments, just simple decorations celebrating the opening of the Emily Mitchell Foundation for Child Welfare. James stood at the podium, Amy by his side, addressing a room full of supporters. "From the darkest deception came our greatest purpose," he began. "This foundation will help children trapped in situations like Amy was, giving them real homes, real opportunities, real love." The foundation's first initiative was a program identifying and supporting young performers vulnerable to exploitation. Amy had helped design it, turning her acting experience into a force for good. "Sometimes the worst lies show us what truth really means," Amy addressed the crowd, her confidence now genuine rather than scripted. "Dad and I learned that together." Martha watched from the side, pride shining in her eyes. The mansion had transformed over the past year. Emily's photos remained, but they shared space with Amy's artwork and academic awards. The garden where Sarah had staged her fake wedding now hosted weekend workshops for foster children. After the ceremony, Detective Rogers stopped by with final case updates. Sarah had been sentenced to 15 years, her network dismantled. The other families she'd conned found closure, and some had even become foundation supporters. "She still looks like Emily," the detective mentioned carefully. "The surgeries were permanent." "But she never was Emily," James replied, at peace with this truth. "She could copy every gesture, every smile, but she couldn't replicate real love." Later that evening, James and Amy visited Emily's grave. It had become their monthly tradition, not out of obligation or performance, but genuine remembrance. "I think she really would be proud," Amy said, arranging fresh flowers, wildflowers she'd picked herself, not the carefully curated lilies Sarah had chosen. "Not just of the foundation, but of us, of how we turned something bad into something good." James smiled, remembering Emily's favorite saying, "Love grows best in unexpected gardens." She couldn't have imagined this particular garden, their unconventional family blooming from the ashes of deception. Back home, Martha had prepared their favorite dinner, not because it matched any memories or fulfilled any script, but simply because it made them happy. As they ate, they planned future foundation projects, their painful past transformed into purposeful action. "Remember what you said that first morning after everything fell apart?" Amy asked, helping Martha with the dishes. "About healing together." James nodded, watching his daughter, now legally and lovingly his, carefully dry each plate. "Best decision we ever made." The evening ended in the study, where Amy was finishing her college applications. Her dream was to study psychology and help other children heal from trauma. On the wall, Emily's photo watched over them, no longer a template for deception, but a guardian of their authentic happiness. Martha brought them hot chocolate, their own tradition, not copied from anyone else's memories. As they sat together, James realized that Sarah's greatest mistake had been thinking she needed to become Emily to be loved. Real love, as they discovered, grew stronger through truth, even painful truth. The foundation's motto, inscribed by the entrance, said it all. From deception, truth. From loss, family. From pain, purpose. And in the garden where Sarah's perfect performance had shattered, real love had finally taken root and bloomed. Some said it was Emily's final gift, not the false signs Sarah had fabricated, but the genuine healing that came after the lies fell away. As night fell over the Mitchell mansion, three people who'd found family and forgiveness sat together, their story proving that the truest love often comes from the most unexpected deceptions. The end. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Amy's place. Would you have chosen truth over a perfect lie? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about love, redemption, and second chances. Remember, sometimes the most beautiful truths bloom from the ashes of our greatest deceptions.